Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of Arab Center Washington, D.C.'s new electronic book titled Biden and the Middle East, A Challenging Road Ahead. My name is Tamara Kharroub. I am the Assistant Executive Director and a Senior Fellow at Arab Center Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's discussion featuring some of the authors of the chapters of the book who've given the time to join us today to provide their policy analyses and recommendations. Arab Center Washington, D.C. is pleased to announce the publication of this compilation of articles focusing on President-elect Joe Biden's administration and policies towards the Middle East going forward as Joe Biden takes office tomorrow, January 20th. We're looking at some of the political, economic, and social challenges facing this administration domestically and internationally, specifically focusing on policies towards the Middle East and North Africa. The book is already available online. You can access a copy electronically on our website at arabcenterdc.org/books. The edited volume features analysis of US policy towards the Middle East and North Africa and is co-edited by two of our research team members, our Director of Research, Imad Harb, and our publications editor, Zeina Azzam, who is with us today. It includes contributions by ACW resident and non-resident fellows, as well as renowned analysts on the Middle East, several of whom are with us today to discuss their analyses. We are fortunate to have them with us. Thank you all for taking the time to join us and to provide your contribution. I'll briefly introduce each of the panelists in speaking order, and then we can move on to the discussion. First, we have Zeina Azzam. As I mentioned, she is a publications editor at Arab Center Washington, D.C. Charles Dunne is non-resident fellow at Arab Center Washington, D.C. Khalil al-Anani is a senior fellow at Arab Center Washington, D.C. Many of them are affiliated with us, as you can see. Zaha Hassan is a human rights lawyer and a visiting fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Zeina Moukalled, joining us from Beirut, is a Lebanese journalist and documentary filmmaker. And Daniel Brumberg is a professor and director of democracy and governance studies at Georgetown University, and he's also a non-resident senior fellow at Arab Center Washington, D.C. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to your remarks. Before we start the discussion, I just want to remind everyone you can send in your questions to our panelists at any time during the discussion. You can use the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, or those who are watching on the website, you can send in your questions by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, that's events@arabcenterdc.org. When you send in your questions, feel free to identify yourself and affiliation and indicate to whom your question is addressed if you have a specific question to a specific panelist. We will try to address as many questions as possible. And now, without further ado, we're going to move to the discussion. I will give each of our panelists 8 to 10 minutes, starting with Zeina, co-editor of the book. Zeina will give an overview of the book, its contents and themes. Zeina, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Tamara. I'm delighted to participate in this webinar today to launch our latest publication, Biden and the Middle East, A Challenging Road Ahead. First, I'd like to recognize my co-editor for the book, Imad Harb, who is the Director of Research and Analysis at ACW. It's been a pleasure for me to work with Imad to bring to light the writings in this most important and timely study. The principal objective of this book is to bring together the perspectives, analysis, and prescriptions by experts about US policy in the Middle East, and to offer them to everyone interested in or working in Middle East affairs. Importantly, we wanted to offer these insights to the new Biden administration team at this critical time. We're well aware that the president-elect faces major and terribly daunting tasks ahead on the domestic front. And we offer this serious evaluation of a number of issues that are essential to consider for a successful foreign policy in the next 4 years. This book also serves as a reminder that as the new administration embarks on addressing its domestic challenges, the significant issues continue to need attention in the Middle East. As I worked on this book, I sensed that the writers composed their thoughts with the understanding, or at least the hope, that President Biden would not pursue President Trump's modus operandi of impulsive, personalistic, and transactional decision-making based on the America First approach. Rather, the assumption and hope is that his foreign policy team will take history and social and political context into account and formulate policy that's beneficial to the United States and to the people of the Middle East. The book comprises 19 chapters and an introduction by ACW Executive Director Khalil. The first section of the book considers overviews of US policy and decision-making regarding the Middle East, as well as cross-cutting themes such as democracy and human rights. We're glad that Charles Dunne, who wrote the chapter on Biden's agenda on democracy and human rights, is with us today. The next 3 sections of the book are divided geographically: the Eastern Mediterranean, the Gulf, and East and North Africa. The chapters were written during November and December 2020, so we've included a few footnotes where any updates were needed. The authors, as you mentioned, are resident and non-resident fellows with ACW and others whom we recruited specifically to write about their areas of expertise. All are seasoned political analysts with deep and broad experience in offering sage assessments of US foreign policy. We're delighted that so many of them are here with us today, and this will be a bouncing off point to explore US policy in the Middle East. Because the region presents researchers with many critical themes to analyze, I looked through the chapters with the aim of pulling out themes that occur often in the book so I could share them with you briefly today. Please note that these are not in any order of importance. Also, I'll be mentioning some, but not all, of the 20 authors in the book. So here are some of these themes. Many authors refer to the sense of relief that people in the Middle East are feeling because Trump was not reelected. Yusuf Munayyer talks about the idea of undoing the damage of the Trump administration's 4 years, while Ahmad Harb writes about what is perceived as its foreign policy malpractice. At the same time, some note that, for example, the regime in Saudi Arabia may not be as sanguine, as it will lose its biggest supporter in Trump, with Christian Coates Ulrichsen reminding us that Antony Blinken, if his nomination to Secretary of State is confirmed, has stated that the Biden administration, quote, would review the US relationship with Saudi Arabia, to which Trump has basically given a blank check to pursue a disastrous set of policies. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi will also lose a reliable friend in Washington since Trump was not reelected, and we're pleased that Khalil al-Anani is with us today to discuss this further. Another theme is whether the Biden presidency would constitute a 3rd term of the Obama administration when Biden served as vice president in its 2 terms. Authors generally felt that the year 2021 is a much different time, and that the exigencies of international relations and the Middle East landscape have changed tremendously. Nevertheless, we see some of the same personalities being nominated for weighty positions. For his part, Radwan Ziadi maintains that this is actually an opportunity for Biden to correct the shortcomings of the Obama administration in Syria. Likewise, Nabil Khouri says that Biden has an opportunity to correct his serious mistakes in Iraq. Another is Iran and its role in conflicts in the Gulf and the Levant, such as Iraq and Syria, in addition to discussion of the possibility that the Biden administration would rejoin the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Some authors pondered whether Biden's team would continue to formulate policy in the region through the prism of Iran, such as in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and other countries. There's a chapter by Dan Brumberg on the US and Iran, and we're glad he's here today to talk about this salient relationship and its reverberations. The US relationship with Israel and Palestine also constitutes an important theme in the book, with a chapter on Israel by Yusuf Munayyer and on Palestine by Zaha Hassan. We're grateful that Zaha Hassan is with us today to amplify her analysis. They explore the history of the relationships and offer ideas on what the Biden administration might do regarding reestablishing diplomatic channels with the PLO and the PA, and reinstituting aid to the Palestinian territories and UNRWA. The Trump administration's push for Arab states to normalize relations with Israel is also discussed in the chapters about the Gulf, since the UAE and Bahrain took that step, as well as an analysis of Moroccan and Sudanese politics. It's noteworthy that in last year's Arab Opinion Index, conducted by our colleagues in Doha at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, the question on corruption in the Arab world indicated that fully 91% of respondents said that corruption exists in both the public and private sectors. So it's not surprising that a number of authors address corruption in Arab states and the schism between elites and citizens with the concomitant economic difficulties. These issues provide necessary context for the formulation of any US policy agenda. Lebanon in particular is a case in point, and we're pleased that Diana Moukalled is with us today to explain the Lebanese situation. The themes of democracy and human rights are also present throughout the book. For example, in Khalil al-Anani's chapter on Egypt, he writes of Sisi's fear that Biden will go back to Obama's focus on the promotion of human rights and civil society. In Iraq, that the Biden administration must not side with narrow security interests and ignore Iraqi civil society leaders who called for democracy, human rights, and an end to corruption. According to Gregory Aftandilian, the situation in Yemen in particular is one that Biden will likely pay attention to, especially that it is of bipartisan concern in Congress. In Sudan, Abdel Khalik Shaib talks about the transition from authoritarianism to a civil military leadership and the need for economic assistance from the United States. The countries of Northwest Africa, Imad Harb says, would benefit from increased US attention to development and democracy promotion. So in my short time this morning, I'm unable to fully convey each author's arguments and prescriptions, but I hope I've given you an overall idea of what is covered in this book. And I urge you all to download the publication or read it on our website soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeina, for this excellent and kind of comprehensive overview of the book's different chapters and themes and topics. I would like to take the opportunity to applaud Zeina Azzam and Imad Harb for the excellent job they did putting this book together as co-editors, and also the contributors, the authors who provided great analyses and policy recommendations. And with that, I would like to turn to Charles Dunne, who will focus on the Biden administration's policies with regards to democracy and human rights in the Middle East. Charles.
Okay. Thank you, Tamara, and thanks, Zeina, for that great introduction to the book, and thanks to the Arab Center for asking me to contribute to this, because the issue of democracy and human rights for the Biden administration is going to be a salient one. And so it's important to understand where they are coming from, particularly with regard to the Middle East, where I think we'll see quite a number of interesting changes. Now, Biden himself, of course, has written that human rights will be at the core of US foreign policy. He's also said that rallying the free world to push back against rising authoritarianism is going to be another element in what he wants to do early, starting in his administration. He's made a number of very interesting appointments to senior policymaking positions that tend to suggest that he means what he says. Anthony Blinken, nominated for Secretary of State, as an established record of supporting democracy and human rights. Linda Thomas Greenfield for UN Ambassador. She's a long-time senior Foreign Service officer, recently served as a board member of the National Endowment for Democracy. Then there's Uzra Zaya for Assistant Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights in the State Department. Again, a longtime senior Foreign Service officer. She helped shape the U.S. response to the Arab Spring. She was acting Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And after she left state, she headed the Alliance for Peace Building, and most recently was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where she focused on democracy and human rights. So if you are looking at personnel appointments in some sense as signaling the way forward and signaling to friends and foes alike what the direction of policy is, these are very encouraging from a democracy and a human rights standpoint. So it seems likely there will be a visible break from the Trump record of excusing rights abuses and defending dictators when they're taking various heinous actions. So democracy and human rights are, of course, sort of two different baskets. They're closely interrelated, but let's, for the purpose of this discussion, separate them. And what does democracy look like for incoming President Biden? Well, he's been very vocal about his intention in his first year in office to launch a summit for democracy in his first year, in fact. And as he has written, this is designed to strengthen our democratic institutions, honestly confront the challenge of nations that are backsliding, and forge a common agenda. So this group of nations that he wants to convene, membership to be determined and kind of hotly contested. A number of countries are wondering who's going to be in, who's going to be out, are also going to be asked by the organizers, the Biden administration, to think of ways they can advance and recommit to human rights in their own country, while they're also considering the problem of confronting worldwide authoritarianism and how they could advance human rights in other countries. Now, the Summit for Democracies is intended mainly as a policy response to push back against Russia and China, whose authoritarian models have been fairly successful in making inroads in terms of influence in other countries during the Trump years. But clearly, it's going to have resonance in a number of other places in the world. And I think especially in the Middle East, which Freedom House has termed one of the least free regions in the world, as they look at what Biden is going to do with this summit and in his early actions on democracy and human rights. One of the things, for example, that President Biden is going to emphasize is anti-corruption efforts. And this is supposed to be a key theme of the Summit for Democracies, because Biden has, of course, correctly linked authoritarianism and human rights abuses. And if he's serious about this, this has implications not only for U.S. policy towards Russia and China, which, as I said, is kind of the main area of pushback for the Summit for Democracy, but it's definitely going to ring bells of the alarm type in Middle Eastern capitals. Again, if Biden is serious about pushing this on a consistent basis, and we do have a few questions to ask about that. One thing President Biden is unlikely to do, in my view, is an embrace an aggressive democratizing agenda in the Middle East anytime soon. I mean, sure, a country such as Tunisia, which Freedom House has rated an electoral democracy, the only one to emerge from the Arab Spring countries of 2011, 2012, Tunisia can expect more political and diplomatic encouragement, probably more foreign aid from the United States than it's received before. And countries that decide to hold elections will be commended for them if they are seen as reasonably free and fair. The Biden administration, in other words, is going to erect, in my view, something of a permission structure, which is a favorite phrase of President Obama's, to encourage and permit and create a kind of a supportive environment for countries that want to move ahead in the Middle East with democratizing steps, so that they are elections, permitting organization of political parties, free organization of civil society, or whatever. But Biden isn't going to go down the road of George W. Bush with an aggressive freedom agenda anytime soon. He is not going to be pushing for elections in transitioning countries or post-conflict societies quickly. And I don't think he is going to be pushing countries who are allies of ours currently, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt, to move ahead with free and fair elections. I think the Biden administration in this field of issues is going to indulge in quiet encouragement of democratic reform in the Middle East. This is going to be expressed through careful public messaging, enhanced ties with civil society and political activists, and restored budgetary support for democracy and governance initiatives. Now, let's turn to the human rights set of issues. And here there's likely to be a sharper break with Trump. And early attention, as Zeina has indicated, is going to be on Saudi Arabia and Egypt, primarily because these are two countries which Biden himself has specifically singled out as being ripe for attention because of their human rights records. Biden, for example, tweeted last year that there will be no more blank checks for Sisi, Trump's favorite dictator, quote unquote, from both Trump and Biden. The Biden administration is likely, therefore, to undertake a review, at least, of the nature and basis of the strategic relationship with Egypt. And it might possibly withhold portions of military aid due to human rights concerns. This is something that the Trump administration also did briefly before it more or less gave up and restored the aid without notable improvements on Egypt's human rights record. But this is something that I believe the Biden administration will at least be willing to revisit. Sisi himself is not going to see the inside of the Oval Office anytime soon, unlike he did under President Trump. And I think Egypt can look forward to additional pressure on some of the key human rights issues that are important in Egypt, particularly the tens of thousands of political prisoners that are being held in abject conditions without due process. He will be pressed to loosen restrictions on civil society, probably freedom of expression. And I think the Biden administration will also look for ways to support political activists in Egypt, both individually when they're arrested or abused by the authorities, and collectively as a movement that can bring about positive change. Saudi Arabia has likewise been singled out primarily for the disastrous war in Yemen. And of course, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's ruthless behavior, primarily with the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Biden, in fact, issued a statement last October to commemorate the second anniversary of the Khashoggi murder. And he has said he's willing to reassess the relationship with Saudi Arabia in support for the war in Yemen, and is not going to check its values at the door to sell arms or buy oil. And that's a direct quote from the president-elect himself. He's also indicated there may be more support for Saudi dissidents, activists, journalists, and so on. Now, all of this will be made a bit easier because there is bipartisan support in Congress for a harder line on Saudi Arabia. In fact, Congress passed legislation to cut off arms sales due to Yemen. Trump vetoed that, of course. But that is going to be an easier road in the Biden administration, I think. And also the decreasing value of Saudi Arabian oil to the United States is another thing that makes it a little bit easier for the Biden administration, if it wants to do so, to take a harder line on the country. And I think these early signals are already having an effect. Saudi Arabia, for example, gave up its boycott of Qatar. In part, at least, as I think a signal to the incoming Biden administration that it wants to, does not want to leave a big problem on the table there. And Egypt, of course, released a number of human rights activists from the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights that had swept up, I think, in late November or early December. um, that again, it wanted to be seen as making at least some kind of gesture to the incoming Biden administration. So these are all signs that these two countries are taking the new administration and the new climate in Washington fairly seriously. Biden hasn't said much about the other human rights abusers in the region, but he's going to need to if he wants to have a credible policy in place. The advancing authoritarianism of Erdogan's Turkey is one thing he is going to have to address. Israel's troubling record in the Palestinian territories, which has recently been termed a form of apartheid by B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, is going to need some form of policy response. And of course, Iran's egregious record on human rights, especially executions, including of minors, for sometimes crimes that wouldn't merit execution in any other legal system, that is going to need to be focused on, even if, and maybe especially if Biden wants to get back into the Iran deal, a nuclear deal, and perhaps put U.S. Policy towards Iran on a new footing. I'm just going to wrap up here briefly by saying this is going to be difficult as a set of policy issues, but it's also true that I think it's going to be difficult because, in a sense, Biden remains a very traditional centrist Democratic politician, and his approach to specific countries, while they might look and sound a great deal different from Trump's, in practice, there's going to be a lot of continuity with previous administrations, including Trump's, in terms of the way they focus attention on human rights and democratization. As I said in my chapter, I think Biden is probably going to remain squarely in the middle of a Washington consensus that prioritizes cooperation with Middle East autocracies on security, military, and counterterrorism issues, and often ignores abuses in the interests of doing business as usual. I am happy, my time is up, but I am happy to discuss specific policy options that the Biden administration has if it wants to show it's really serious on a robust human rights and democracy agenda in the Middle East. But maybe we can leave that for questions if anybody would like to bring it up during the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. These are indeed difficult but very important issues and tests for the Biden administration's commitment to human rights and democracy in the region. And now we move to future US policy in Egypt with Khalil al-Anani. Khalil, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Tamara, for the opportunity to participate in this panel. Let me begin my remarks by highlighting the different feelings and reactions and responses that happened among Egyptians to the victory of Biden by the US elections a couple of months ago, particularly among the regime and the opposition. On the regime side, you can have a sense, or you can see a sense of anxiety, unease, maybe fear of possible change of the relationship between Washington and Cairo, particularly in relation to democracy and human rights issues. This anxiety expressed itself in three symbolic yet meaningful signs or steps. The first sign, Sisi was the first an Arab president to congratulate Biden for his victory. This was just when the media called Pennsylvania to Biden on November 7th. The second sign, if people follow the Egyptian or the pro-Sisi media, they would find that they began attacking Biden since day one in the elections. And they also were adopting Trump's false accusations and claims about the fraud elections and that he won the elections, not Biden. Also, they repeated the baseless and conspiracy accusations of Obama administration that Biden will be supporting Islam's, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, the same narrative that was repeated during Obama administration time regarding Egypt. More than symbolic step, that just a week after the election, the Egyptian government hired a lobbying firm to enhance communications with the incoming administration, paying them around $65,000 per month to enhance connections with Biden's transition team. On the other side, on the Egyptian opposition side, you can find sense of optimism and hope that Biden administration will not support Sisi, at least in the same way that Trump did over the last 4 years. and Sisi will not be anymore the favorite dictator of Biden as he was to Trump. Particularly the pro-opposition media in exile, particularly in Turkey and other places, they celebrated Trump's loss and welcomed Biden's victory with hope that he will change course in the US-Egyptian relationship. So between these two different reactions, between this fear and anxiety on the one side and hope and optimism on the other side, lies the complexity, or if you like, the dilemma of the US-Egyptian relationship, which raises the question of to what extent we might witness a change in this relationship under Biden's administration, or it will be, as Charles mentioned, will be business as usual by supporting autocratic regimes in the region. To answer this question, I think we need to dig a little bit deep and to have a quick look in history of the US-Egyptian relationship. And very quickly, over the last 4 decades, Egypt and the US have developed strong relationship with either Democratic or Republican administrations, to the extent that Egypt has become one of the most important and key allies to the US in the region, which helped it to achieve the US strategic interests over the past decades. As a result, Egypt has become the second biggest recipient of the US foreign aid after Israel, with about $1.3 billion of military and economic assistance. And some you can speak of at least $84 billion since 1946 until now. Most of them came after the signing of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1979, almost $70 billion since that time until now. This strategic cooperation between Egypt and the US cuts across multiple domains, but especially prominent in areas of security, defense, intelligence, and counterterrorism. Also, the relationship between Egypt and Israel plays a very important role in strengthening the alliance with Washington. Both countries, Egypt and Israel, have not witnessed any wars or clashes since they signed the peace treaty in 1979. Washington considers this unique relationship as a cornerstone for its regional policy, so to speak. Also, Egypt plays a very key role in ensuring Israel's security, particularly in its western border with Gaza, which has been controlled by Hamas since 2007. On multiple occasions, Egypt played a mediating role between Israel and Hamas, helping to maintain a shaky ceasefire and preventing military tensions from flaring up between the two parties. Also, the security, the economic relationship between Israel and between Egypt have grown over the last few decades, particularly in the fields of oil and natural gas, which we saw over the last few decades. Despite this unique relationship between the US and between Egypt, the relationship also witnessed some tensions over the last few decades, particularly the last 2 decades. I can just refer to a couple of examples here. Under the administration of President Bush, George W. Bush, the United States pressured Mubarak to open up the political space and to give more space to political parties. That's why Egypt witnessed for the first time a presidential election in 2005, despite everything. But it was the first time to have such elections, which Mubarak, of course, won at that time. Also, when the uprising of 2011 started, Obama administration pressured Mubarak to transfer power. And when he refused, they abandoned him, and this led to his downfall on February 2011. Despite all that, the Obama administration failed to condemn what happened on July 3rd after the coup of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And what they did only that they suspended partial of its assistance to Egypt, particularly the delivery of some military equipment, as a response to the brutal repression of Sisi against peaceful protests in Rabaa and Al-Nahda. And this suspension was removed only a year and a half after that, in March 2015. The unprecedented relationship happened particularly under Trump. Trump gave carte blanche for Sisi to do whatever he wants, particularly when it comes to human rights and democracy. And Sisi and Trump were known to share a strong personal relationship that was further strengthened by Sisi's crucial role in facilitating what's called or so-called peace plan, Trump peace plan between Palestinians and between Israelis, despite the fact this comes at the expense of the basic Palestinian rights. this unique relationship led Trump to call Sisi in one of the leaks that he is his favorite dictator, as we know. So I can speak of at least 4 key issues that would define Biden administration policies towards Egypt in the coming 4 years. The first issue, as Charles mentioned, democracy and human rights. Clearly, Biden administration seems to give priority to human rights and democracy, not only in Egypt, but also around the world. So this is a clear sign that Biden will not tolerate the human rights violations as Trump did, at least. And this also clear from the formation of Biden's team, particularly the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and also the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Both of them have so far a good record of defending democracy and human rights around the world. So we might expect some change in that regard, but not to the extent that can lead to significant change when it comes to the strategic collaboration between both countries. And this is my second point, that we shouldn't expect a significant change in the strategic collaboration between Egypt and between the US under Biden administration. Yes, Biden might go harsh a little bit on human rights issue in Egypt, but not to the extent that this would happen at the expense of the strategic issues that would include security, intelligence, collaboration, and counterterrorism between Egypt and between the US. The third point about the regional repositioning now. The last 4 years witnessed a significant change in the balance of power in the region that led to the emergence of a new axe of alliances that would include Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, and Jordan. So this new regional order, if you like, would impose a lot of difficulties on Biden to change the course of the US policy in the region. So Egypt will remain a very important regional ally to Biden that would not allow him to go harsh on human rights and democracy issues in Egypt. So I don't think that he will be able to roll back what happened over the last 4 years and ignore them while navigating his steps in the region. The fourth point, or the fourth issue that will define Biden's policy towards Egypt, would be the relationship between Israel and Egypt. Maintaining the strong relationship between both countries is a cornerstone for the US policy in the region, which significantly would affect the US policy towards Egypt. As I mentioned before, while Biden will try to navigate the relationship with Israel government, we know that there is no such harmony between Netanyahu and between Biden. It would be very careful not to harm the relationship between Egypt and Israel, regardless who is in power in Israel. So I think this issue will define Biden's relationship with Egypt in the coming 4 years. Does this mean that there is no hope? I think we might have some sort of cautious optimism. And that's why Sisi is a little bit worried from Biden. And we can see some signs over the last couple of months that he released some of the political prisoners in Egypt, particularly from the secular and liberal parties and activists, but not the extent that he would change course and have some sort of reconciliation in Egypt that would lead to opening up the political sphere and giving more freedoms to the opposition. I would imagine the relationship to go back to the Mubarak era relationship, that the US would criticize and condemn some of the violations, but not the extent that can lead to significant impact on the bilateral relationship between both countries. What we might witness is the rising role of some congressmen who might condemn and even ask for putting conditions on the US military aid to Egypt in order to improve its record in human rights issues. I agree with Charles that we shouldn't expect that Biden will meet Sisi or will invite him to the White House, at least in the first couple of years. We don't know what would happen in the future. But also we shouldn't overlook or underestimate what Sisi can do to retaliate if Biden did any changes in the policies towards Egypt, particularly when it comes to human rights and democracy. Sisi also has some cards that he can play. For instance, he can strengthen the relationship with Russia, which is one of the main adversaries of the US now, China, so China and Russia. Also, he might use human rights as a negotiating cards with Sisi. With this, I would end my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalil, for this interesting analysis. And we'll see whether the Biden administration will go beyond rhetoric with regards to criticizing Egyptian abuse of human rights. And now we have Zaha Hassan, who will focus on relationships with and policies towards Palestine and Israel. Zaha?
Thanks, Tamara, and thanks to the Arab Center for inviting me to contribute to the ebook, and thanks for the invitation to provide some thoughts on what we can expect from the new administration on the Palestine-Israel peace file. I'll talk first about the Biden administration's agenda and what it will look like toward Palestinians and Israel-Palestine peace more generally. Then I'll discuss how Palestinians have been responding to this agenda already and whether their best efforts can really make a difference in the long run. Finally, I'll talk about some of the major challenges that the Biden administration will be confronted with in trying to preserve the two-state solution, which it remains committed to. So what are the Biden administration's priorities? The next administration will be preoccupied at home with the pandemic and the economic recovery, and its engagement in the Middle East will be primarily focused on Iran and getting the JCPOA back online. That means its goals around Palestine-Israel peace will be very modest. They will center around preserving the possibility of a two-state solution and will involve mainly three elements. First, reversing some of the most egregious Trump actions. Two, restoring bilateral relations with Palestinians. And three, restarting bilateral aid to them. On all three of these fronts, the Biden administration will find major difficulties waiting for them. First, with respect to reversing Trump's most egregious actions, while a new administration can easily announce that it's taking the Trump plan off the table and can freely issue policy statements expressing its commitment to past U.S. positions on settlements, on the labeling of products from the West Bank, on the use of terms like occupied territory in reference to the West Bank and Gaza, it will have a harder time in actually taking tangible actions to give its policy life. The most noteworthy example is the Biden administration's intention to keep the U.S. Embassy to Israel in Jerusalem, despite its acknowledging that the move complicates the prospects for Palestine-Israel peace. Given that the administration will be engaged in active battle with Israel around the JCPOA coming back online, the Biden administration may feel reversing Trump actions will unnecessarily create additional friction with Israel. So it's likely to put off any such moves for another day further along in the administration. This, however, risks inertia, and it allows Israel to build its opposition to any such moves by the new administration. On the restoration of bilateral relations, the new administration will continue to be hamstrung by federal legislation that would require the PA and the PLO to end the system that provides social welfare benefits to Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails and families of those killed in political violence with Israel. While the administration has executive power to allow a PLO mission to open in Washington, it cannot shield the PLO and PA from civil liability for having done so. The PA is finding it politically difficult to end the social welfare system given its popularity among the Palestinian public. It will also have a difficult time, the PA, with trying to establish a more generalized social welfare system based on need, given the vastness of Palestinian need and the destitution, which is a direct result of the Israeli occupation. Now, on starting bilateral economic assistance, the new administration now has authorization and appropriations from Congress to engage in people-to-people programming and private sector business enterprises for Palestinians. However, the enterprise fund envisioned, which prioritizes joint projects between Israelis and Palestinians, is likely to face problems in how it is administered because settler enterprises are not specifically excluded from the program. The Joint Investment for Peace Initiative, as it is known, will likely be fed by monies from the Abraham Fund, established following the tripartite agreement between the Emiratis, Israel, and the US. If it is, it will take some serious effort to ensure that funds don't go to facilitate and support settlements. Thus far, the secondary agreements concluded by the UAE with Israel as a product of the Abraham Accords have not distinguished between Israel and its settlements in the West Bank. So against this policy backdrop, what has the PLO and PA response to the election of Joe Biden been? Well, since it became clear that Joe Biden would be the next US president, the PLO and PA leadership announced its intention to reform this system of social welfare payments to prisoners and families of those killed in political violence with Israel, and it has begun taking actions to allow for PA and PLO elections. In the last week, President Abbas has repealed the election law that would have required Hamas candidates for PA elections to swear an oath to the PLO political platform and principles. It also appears that Hamas and Fatah will make an effort to steer clear from an election outcome that would entrench the existing divide or raise the ire in Washington. In this regard, Hamas has agreed not to run a PA presidential candidate and is open to running a joint list of candidates for PA legislative seats with Fatah. The PA legislative elections are to take place in May, presidential elections in July, and mechanisms for elections for the PLO parliament will be discussed during the national dialogue that will open up in February. The question is, will all of this have any impact on the quality and character of US engagement on the peacemaking file? While national reconciliation and political renewal are important and necessary as a Palestinian priority, the Biden foreign policy team has already indicated that it does not intend to leverage its assistance to Israel to discourage de facto annexation and settlement construction. It also will not publicly chastise Israel for bad actions, but will have private conversations to encourage it to conform to its obligations as an occupying power. Given that the administration will be focused on mitigating Israeli opposition to the US rejoining the Iran nuclear agreement, it is unlikely to spend a lot of its political capital with Israel on peacemaking with Palestinians. So what are the biggest challenges that the Biden administration will face? Biden's commitment to urge Arab states to normalize with Israel will undermine its efforts to preserve the two-state solution. Why? Israel's interest in normalization isn't about the peace and security of the Middle East region. It's about legitimizing its sovereignty over Jerusalem and the West Bank. The UAE-Israel Normalization Agreement and the agreements with Bahrain and Morocco established diplomatic relations, yes. But the agreements were also promises to recognize the sovereignty of the other's territory and to conclude further bilateral agreements. These secondary agreements are in fields such as tourism, trade, and telecommunications, and will invariably test the extent to which Arab governments are prepared to differentiate between Israel and the territory its military occupies by force. The UAE has already shown that it is not concerned about respecting international law and its obligation under the UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which called on third states to not recognize the international illegality of Israeli settlement construction in occupied territories. The UAE has concluded trade deals with settler enterprises. It has plans for joint economic development in East Jerusalem, which will require the demolition and eviction of Palestinian businesses there. And it has established the Abraham Fund for joint projects with Israel without reference to Palestinian rights. And it promised to maintain an office for the fund in Jerusalem. Will the Biden administration ask the UAE to pull back from activities that facilitate settlements and settler business activities? And will it ask other Arab states that have concluded agreements or are thinking of concluding agreements to do the same? We'll have to wait and see about that. And I'll take questions after the rest of the program. Thanks.
Thank you, Zaha, very much. And there are quite a few questions about these issues that we'll address in the Q&A session. And for now, we'll move to Diana Moukalled and US policy towards Lebanon and the Eastern Mediterranean. Diana, go ahead.
Thank you, Tamara. Well, Lebanon is experiencing a dramatic situation. The country suffers from its worst financial collapse in history and from a political and economic crisis. Last August, Lebanon was hit by the horrendous explosion at the port of Beirut that killed 200 and maimed thousands of people. That was indeed the biggest crime in the history of Lebanon. And we have a history which is full of wars, crises, and assassinations. It's well known that the responsibility for the explosion falls on the shoulders of neglectful, bureaucratic, corrupt, sectarian political elites. The explosion and the prior organized heist of the bank deposits of ordinary Lebanese show how vicious the dominant political class in the country. any American administration should take this reality into serious consideration. It's true that the country is inseparable from the region as Iran becomes more entrenched in Lebanese affairs and institutions, causing major failure on many levels. But addressing Lebanon from the Iranian angle only will make things worse. Blustering Lebanon's corrupt sectarian and guilty political class will not bring security or stability. Corruption in Lebanon was not the decisive factor in how the Trump administration dealt with the country. Instead, Trump's hardline policy towards some factions in Lebanon was dictated by the confrontation with Iran. In other words, as Lebanon continues to suffer from its troubles, it is in danger of being merely byproduct of how the new Biden administration will deal with Iran. While Lebanon is a small state that may not figure prominently in the Biden administration's policy towards the Middle East, it continues to be the meeting place of many important regional interference. For example, Saad Hariri's difficulty in forming a new government since he was designated as prime minister in October is only a reflection of the mutual local and regional influences on the country. Till this minute, he failed in forming a new government. Many domestic actors are beholden to regional powers who have their own preferences on how they use the Lebanese crisis as leverage into negotiations inside or outside the region, as the case is today with Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. Yes, we cannot blame it all on regional powers. It's true that the Lebanese leaders have wasted people's savings while the dominant political class continue to rule the country and protect its own interests. Hezbollah holds sway in the country, while the Lebanese army, which had been the darling of the United States for decades, stands accused of crimes against activists, protesters, and refugees. Lebanon's record in freedom of expression and human rights is deteriorating tremendously. Indeed, military intelligence has become beholden to President Michel Aoun and his ally, Hezbollah. The general liberties and rights for which Lebanon was known in the region are disappearing as security forces and state institutions threaten activists, journalists, and many other who are activists with physical harassment or persecution. The new Biden administration should be well aware of this grim picture of Lebanon, which in effect led to the October 2019 protests that raised the famous slogan, "Killun yani killun," all means all, against the entire ruling class. What weakened the protest movement and blunted its reform agenda was an unforgiving combination of financial and economic collapse, sectarian polarization and division, the coronavirus pandemic, and well-armed militia and major power player Hezbollah. If Biden is to address Lebanon's problems, he needs to pay attention to the dual scourge of the corrupt political class and its dominant regional connection. As a border state with Syria, Lebanon has not been able to escape the repercussions of the war raging there on security, economical, and human levels. Almost 900,000 Syrians are registered as refugees in Lebanon. Lebanon's political factions have been split along the lines of supporters and opponents to Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, depending on the relationship with Hezbollah, which since 2012 has thrown its military might behind the Assad regime. In fact, the Hezbollah-Syria relation has linked Lebanon's fate to that of Syria and Iran. In Biden's case, dealing with Lebanon will be related to how he addresses relations with Syria, Israel, and Iran. Trump administration imposed several sanctions on Lebanese entities and figures, mainly ones related to Hezbollah. What sanctions were able to accomplish was to force Lebanon to sit at the negotiating table with Israel to reach agreement on demarcating borders. Here, the most crucial question regarding the Biden administration policy towards Lebanon is whether it will continue to deal with the country as a sanctioned polity. The answer has serious and disrupting repercussions. continuing with sanctions will only deepen the current economic and financial collapse. As for Hezbollah, it was clear that Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, and Iran see Biden's election as a positive development because of their conviction that Democrats in general are more amenable to a reconciliation towards Tehran. On the other hand, there's a real concern in the region about a return to Obama's previous policy that was almost a complete withdrawal from the Middle East, leaving it totally to autocrats and their local allies and proxies. The impact of Obama's approach was no less than catastrophic. In fact, that it was happened since the start of the Arab Spring, when Iran, Russia, and Turkey, all authoritarian states, became the real actors and many devastating wars gripped the region. These autocratic states benefited from the American withdrawal during Obama's tenure and Trump's cuddling of dictators. This is why it is extremely important for Biden to end Trump's populist approach to the region, but also to avoid Obama's grave mistakes. By doing both, Biden may be able to bring Lebanon to the attention of the international community in order to help the country work on the needed reforms and address Hezbollah's weapons and the status as a state within a state. This marriage between corruption and Hezbollah illegal status is as an armed militia has to be addressed if Lebanon's long-term interests are to be preserved. Thank you. Back to you, Tamara.
Thank you, Diana, for this excellent contribution. And now, last but not least, we'll move to Iran and the Gulf countries and what to expect from the Biden administration with Dan Brumberg. Dan?
Thank you, Tamara. Good morning to everybody. Thanks so much for having me in this session. I really enjoy the comments of my colleagues, which really helping me to frame how I'm going to talk about this enormously complex issue just in a few minutes. And I'm going to start by piggybacking a little bit on what Diana said, because I do think that the key thing to keep in mind in terms of any effort by the Biden administration to re-engage with Iran and reestablish the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, is that the region has been transformed in dramatic ways that are going to serve as huge constraints on what the Biden administration can do. And while we easily notice and focus on the discontinuity, obviously, between Obama and Trump and now Biden, there are lines of continuity, particularly in terms of the fact that Obama was in some sense a kind of populist president, in the sense that he really wanted to focus on the domestic arena in the United States and sort of withdrew American presence in the region in very significant ways. And in a strange kind of way, Trump sort of continued that policy in his own special way. And so the region has been, and as I've been writing now for some time, sort of managing its own affairs. And under Trump, the tendency was to follow the leaders in the region, particularly when it was expedient to do so, rather than to establish American priorities or even as kind of coherent strategy towards anything. And that is certainly the case on Iran. Now, I do think that we will expect and shall see a major break here with the Biden administration, and that is an effort by the new administration to go back to the JCPOA and not only reestablish that agreement, but widen the discussion with Iran eventually to discuss things such as, well, certainly ballistic missiles, but the wider question of Iran's influence in the region. But the paradox here is that while the Biden administration envisions a wider discussion, its ability to hold that discussion, but more importantly, its leverage in the region is considerably diminished. And that is going to be a challenge for the administration to match, as many of us already have said in this discussion, its actions and its leverage with its words and its aspirations. I think we're going to see a fairly significant gap in that regard too, because it's not going to be easy, and I'll discuss why in a moment, to sort of move Iran on these issues in significant ways. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what the Biden administration will do first and second. In the piece I wrote for the Arab Center, I talked about waiting for some time before it really moves on Iran. We'll see where it goes. It's got a lot of other priorities, including the domestic political arena, COVID, and the rest of it. It has to establish a clear dialogue with its European allies who are really pushing for a very quick change on Iran. But I think the Biden administration may resist that initially. We'll see. So it's got a lot of pressure to sort of move quickly, but there's a lot of factors, including the domestic factors in the Senate and the House, that will stop the administration from moving too quickly. I think it's worth mentioning that there are, and here I'll echo what Charles said in terms of mentioning just what the sort of foreign policy arena looks like in the administration. Here I would remind everybody that Khalil, who was Biden's advisor on security affairs, is going to be Deputy Undersecretary of State for Policy in the Pentagon. I worked with Khalil for, well, about off and on for about 4 years, and I deeply respect him. I also know he's very committed to the JCPOA, has defended it in very, I think, cogent ways in the past, and he's going to be a major player in the administration in trying to push for a re-engagement on some level with Iran. And I think that's a good thing, because he's somebody with enormous credibility and intelligence. And there are others, of course, in the administration who are equally talented, and they're going to be committed, but they're going to find a lot of constraints in their way. So what are the constraints? Well, I mean, we've already mentioned them before, one of which is the Abraham Accords and the sort of rejiggering of the regional relationships in the Gulf, particularly and Israel. That includes, of course, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, which is not in the Gulf, but is part of that sort of change, which significantly is going to constrain what the Biden administration will do. Its relationship with Israel and with Bibi is not going to be very easy, but I would say that now we're not really talking about a relationship per se with Israel, but a transformed strategic arena that's going to place constraints on the administration to re-engage very quickly or dramatically with Iran. The other thing to keep in mind is that paradoxically, or perhaps not so paradoxically, Iran's leverage has increased under the Trump administration. It's increased in many ways. Of course, the Trump administration adopted a policy essentially of a regime change. That was the essence of the Trump administration, although Trump administration folks would deny it, but it really wanted to bring down the regime. And that only strengthened the hardliners. It meant that Iranians were suffering each and every day from accumulating sanctions, but it didn't change the power relationships. It actually reinforced hardliners in Iran, and also increased Iran's determination to flex its muscles in the region. And that it has been doing that very well and in a very sort of calculated, rational way. But it has enormous resources, as already has been said, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in the Gulf, and it's going to be able to use those if it chooses to do so. Moreover, once Iran faced an administration, the Trump administration, that was determined basically to bring the regime down, the Iran decided that its only other negotiating leverage was to sort of systematically walk away from the agreement, from the JCPOA. And most recently, it's committed to enriching uranium to 20%. A deliberate effort to sort of violate the agreement by signaling, therefore, Europe and the United States that if you don't play ball, we're just going to slowly walk away from the agreement. And so Iran's enrichment has increased over time. And now it's going to have to, it's in a position to sort of negotiate that enhanced enrichment as part of any negotiating package. And Iran will, of course, demand that the JCPOA be restored and that sanctions, including the additional sanctions imposed by Trump, will be removed, and that it will be a kind of implicit or explicit precondition. Foreign Minister Zarif said no preconditions, but I think Iran will play hardball in this regard. And that's going to put the administration in a very difficult spot, particularly in Congress. So it's going to face an Iranian administration that has good reason not to trust Biden as well, despite, the Iranians see a lot more continuity in terms of US policy, and they don't reduce things to who's sitting in the Oval Office. And even though they are mildly encouraged, if not more mildly encouraged by the change, which they were desperate to see happen, they also understand that the administration is not going to simply walk away from US foreign policy priorities. And so we can expect the Iranians to play hardball and make it more difficult for Biden sort of to move forward. So what does this mean? And I'll end here so we can get involved in the discussion. It means that the Biden administration will have the impulse, the strategic impulse, and I think it's important because the effort to return to an agreement with Iran really represents an understanding that there are two camps in Iran. I'll conclude here. One is the development camp. The development camp is basically we need to produce oil, we need to sell oil, we need to engage with the world community in the West based on a development strategy that is hinged to oil, and that is the sort of pragmatic, centrist position of the foreign policy establishment, and many leaders in Iran as well. And then there's the resistance camp, the hardliners, who see a very different foreign policy perspective. I think that the camp that favors the camp A, the pragmatic production development camp, will prevail, but they're going to find it very hard to do so against the hardliners, but they're going to push. But they are also going to be constrained by their own domestic arena. So what it means is that the Biden administration has chosen correctly to understand what's at stake and embrace re-engagement with Iran, but it's going to be very hard to move forward with that aspiration given all the constraints that I've mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And thanks to all of you for the excellent analyses and remarks. We have a few questions coming in, so I'm sure we'll have a chance to elaborate on some of these issues. I'll read maybe 3 at a time and address them to some of you, but please give me a signal if you'd like to add something or comment. We have a question. I'll start with maybe 3 overarching questions regarding the meet. He says, it seems that a major focus of the new administration regarding Iran would be backing off of sanctions and returning to the diplomatic approach. He says many of them are pleading for a similar readjustment with regard to policy towards Syria, diplomatic solutions rather than sanctions. So that's a little bit focusing on Syria, and I'd like to make a note here that we do have a chapter on Syria by our senior fellow Radwan Ziadeh. We couldn't have everyone join us for this webinar, but if you're interested in Syria and policy towards Syria in particular, please feel free to go to our website and read that chapter. But if any of the panelists would like to comment on that, please do so. The second question I'll read now is from Gregory Aftendilian, and question for Charles and Khalil Anani. If Biden makes a push for Palestine-Israel peace, will that lessen the US push for democracy and human rights in Egypt, as the US administration will have to seek Egypt's help in the peace process? And the third question for this round from Bill Gant, I believe. Now that Jared Kushner is no longer Middle East envoy, will Arab countries continue to seek diplomatic relations with Israel? And I guess probably like more Arab countries, maybe that's what he means. Let's start with these 3 questions, and maybe we can start with Charles and then move on. Charles?
Sure. Yeah, I think if relations with Egypt come down to a choice between supporting human rights in the country and gaining the Egyptian government's cooperation on regional stability issues, Arab-Israeli peace issues, those are going to take precedence, as they have, for decades. And this is why I'm suggesting in my chapter and what I said in my remarks, which is that President Biden is very much part of this centrist, traditionalist way of looking at the region, and very pragmatic. That's not to say transactional in the way that President Trump was, but very pragmatic. And, I imagine the Egyptian government is going to be seeking ways to emphasize its importance to the Biden administration, emphasizing the importance of Suez Canal access, importance of its relationship with Israel, its counterterrorism efforts, a whole raft of issues in which it contributes to regional stability. And it's going to try to make that the framing device for its relationship with Biden in a way, in a very important way, to reduce the pressure on human rights. And if I had to bet right now, I would say that stands a fairly good chance of being successful.
Khalil, would you like to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tamara, and thanks, Gregory, for this very important question. I would just add to what Charles just mentioned about the historical trade-off that is always there between US and Egypt when it comes to the geostrategic collaboration at the expense also of the democracy and human rights. I mean, Mubarak regime used to play this game in a very good fashion, but however, it ended up with his downfall. So it will be another mistake from Biden to repeat the same thing again, they make this kind of trade-off between gaining Egypt's collaboration and strategic collaboration at the expense of human rights and democracy, because this will not lead at all to a stable country as he might think. The second point is very crucial here, that Egypt lost a lot of its regional weight, unfortunately, for different reasons. We don't have time to go through these reasons or factors, internally and externally. And there is an emerging players that might play, I will not say replace Egypt's role when it comes to Israel and Palestinian issue, but can play a very important role, particularly the UAE, for instance, now. And by the way, this is one of the key issues now that is rising between Egypt and the UAE. There are some tensions over this kind of collaboration between Israel and UAE that might come at the expense of Egyptian traditional role in the region. So it is in the ball in the Biden's court, to what extent he might not go back to this trade-off that actually led to nothing. And also to have this kind of understanding that a stable Egypt should be a democratic Egypt, not Egypt that is based mainly on suppressing people in order to gain the support of the regime, not the people itself. And always the mantra here, or the fear in Washington circles, is that if Egypt has democracy, it will lead to an Islamist kind of role. Even if this would be the case, which I really doubt. But if we go back and look at what Morsi did, particularly when it comes to the Palestinian issue, he brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza in December 2012. So he also played by the rules of the game. He didn't change the rules of the game. So it would be very wise from Biden administration to try to make a change when it comes to the democracy issue, and not to make the trade-off that used to be the case over the last 4 decades.
Thank you, Khalil. Zaha, would you like to address the question about normalization deals or further normalization deals now that Jared Kushner is gone or will be gone? Are these tied to Kushner, or do you expect the Biden administration to push for more?
Thanks. Definitely, the Biden administration supports Arab normalization with Israel, as did successive U.S. administrations. Successive U.S. administrations have attempted to break Arab resolve around normalizing with Israel through incentives, similar to what Trump had done with the UAE and others, but in a less grand scale. And it wasn't as ostentatious as what President Trump did. But this has been, policy for some time now. And I expect to see that with the Biden administration, particularly since the campaign had indicated that its intention to urge Arab governments to take bold actions towards normalization. The question, and which I alluded to in my opening remarks, was whether or not the administration will preserve and protect Palestinian territorial claims and residency rights in Jerusalem, or whether or not it will pursue the regional economic integration and strategic infrastructure development that the UAE hopes to lead the way towards under the Abraham Fund. That's what remains to be seen, but absolutely, I think the Biden administration will seek to pursue normalization agreements. It's been a boon for the Trump administration and for Republicans to be able to point to all this progress on the normalization front. And I think the pressure will be on the Biden team to follow suit.
Thanks, Zaha. I'll read another round of questions, but if you feel like you want to answer a previous question, please go ahead as well. There's a question from John Anderson about Palestinians as well. He says, as we take up the issue of full equality for Palestinians, whether under one state or two states, how will Palestinians deal with the right of return, family reunification, and calls for full equality under the law? It's a bit general, but feel free to comment on the general terms. He also says, how should the Americans approach the discussion regarding equality for Palestinians, and what positions should we press the Biden administration to pursue in terms of bilateral relations with Arab states, UN, and international arenas? Question about Iran. Omar Masri says the Iranian leadership has promised their people and regional stakeholders thunderous and game-changing military response to the US Israel-led assassinations of the past year. Given Iran's eagerness to bring the JCPOA back to life at one point, does Iran give up and take its military revenge against the US and Israeli military away? I'll read another question from, well, there are a couple of questions from Bill Gant. Will the Biden administration help the struggling Tunisian economy to prevent this new democracy from destabilizing? And how will the US-Iraqi relations change under the Biden administration? And here also, I would like to note again that we do have chapters on each of these countries, one on the Biden administration's policies towards Tunisia and one focusing on Iraq. So for more elaborate analysis and details, please feel free to refer to those. But if also any of our panelists would like to comment, go ahead. And I would like to start with Dan, if you would.
Sure, I'll just, there are two questions on Iran out there very quickly. The first one that came up before, and that is Iran, Syria. I don't expect the Biden administration to be in a position to really have much leverage on the question of Syria. The key countries that have leverage are, first of all, Russia, and then, of course, another key player is Iran, and then there is Turkey, and the U.S. has really sort of chosen to sort of withdraw from that arena. It's not going to be a major player. The Astana process, which Russia controls, is more important now to Syria's future than the Geneva process, and that's going to be a hard nut to crack for the Biden administration. So, you know, as far as retaliation for the assassination of Soleimani, I think the Iranian government will find one way or another to do this, but it's going to be very shrewd and calculated in the way it does this, because it really doesn't want to retaliate in a way that's going to jeopardize its ability to talk to the Biden administration. So I think that there's been an interesting story of strategic restraint, not only from Iran, but from the United States and Israel in the region for the past year. Everybody understands there are red lines that don't want to cross them. So I don't expect a major retaliatory strike from Iran anytime soon. That is, of course, assuming nothing happens today. You never know. This is the last day of the Trump administration. We may be in for a surprise, but barring that.
Thank you, Dan. Anyone else would like to respond to the questions that were raised in the last round? Charles, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, maybe I can respond to Bill Gant's question briefly on Iraq and the nature of the relationship between the United States and Iraq in a Biden administration. To be honest with you, I haven't been totally impressed with Vice President Biden's previous positions on Iraq. He came out in favor of dividing the country into basically ethnic stands at one point as a solution to all of the internal problems that Iraq had. He was, for a while, President Obama's point person for Iraq in the White House. And I guess he more or less competently managed the relationship, but I don't think he wanted a greater US involvement in the problems, which is understandable. But I also didn't get the impression that he really stood up for Iraqi democracy, internal security, and unity, which is the most important thing. I think a President Biden will want to revisit this issue. I think he would be more willing to have a slightly larger troop presence to show commitment to stability in Iraq than President Trump has wanted to do. And I think he'll have a more consistent policy in dealing with the Iraqi government, which is in a position where it can go in several different directions, including some of them quite positive. And this really does need some encouragement, some policy encouragement from the United States. And of course, an Iraqi collapse presents same issues for the United States in the region as it has for many years. So this is going to be need to be paid attention to by the Biden administration. I think Biden will be a little more committed to at least a consistent policy and some more diplomatic attention than the Trump administration has, which I think would head in the right direction.
Zaha?
Yeah, thanks. I'll start with a question about what Biden policy could do that would be helpful in terms of getting, or moving the dial a bit on Israel-Palestine peace. One thing that I think is really important that the Biden administration do, and it can do, if it's not interested in leveraging security assistance to Israel to get Israel to stop settlement construction, one thing that it can do is to condition its support for Arab normalization and the subsequent deals that would involve the Abraham Fund. It can condition that on Israel's stopping settlement construction, and it can, call on the Arab states that are engaged in normalization to refrain and use its influence with those states to refrain from doing anything that would jeopardize Palestinian territorial claims or rights in the occupied territories. A Biden administration could also change its posture toward international institutions. It could support UN activities that call for Israeli compliance with international law. It could stand down from threatening the ICC prosecutor and judges for taking up cases related to Israeli human rights abuses and impunity in the occupied territories. And another thing that's really important that I think it can and should do is related to its posture towards East Jerusalem. Fine, it's not going to relocate the embassy back to Tel Aviv, the US embassy to Tel Aviv, but what it can do is to restore the consulate. And that's just one thing. What it can also put pressure on Israel to allow Palestinian elections to take place in Jerusalem. It can encourage Israel to protect and preserve Palestinian residency rights and refrain from evictions of families and home demolitions in the city. And it can reopen Palestinian institutions that have been closed for some time now and allow, a signal to Israel that the US does recognize that in a future Palestinian state, East Jerusalem will be the capital. It can take measures that are tangible related to Jerusalem to make that clear to Israel.
Thank you, Zaha. I'll read another round of questions and we'll see how much time we have left after that. A question to Diana, could you please update us on the newest information that the ammonium nitrate that exploded at the Beirut port belonged to the Syrian regime? is this information being taken seriously in Lebanon? Another question for Zaha: how do you think the Biden administration will handle the upcoming Israeli elections? Will it try to influence the outcome or stay aloof? A question also about Gulf countries like the UAE. Now that Trump is no longer president, will the UAE continue to help the Trump company build properties in the Middle East? If any of you has any information on this. A question to Zeina: you've mentioned that there were some updates to the content of the book. Can you give us a little more information about what kind of updates and why? And question to Khalil and Charles from Mustafa Youssef: how can we pressure Biden's administration to release all political prisoners? Lobbying by UAE, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. How can you counter that lobbying effort? And couple more questions about Palestine. I'm just going to go through them all and then give you the last 5 minutes to take whatever questions you'd like to respond to. A question to, a couple of questions about Palestine, sorry. To Zaha: how do you see it? Do you see a situation where Biden's continued support for his two-state solution in conjunction with likely Israeli settlement expansion actually hasten a change in US policy towards a one-state solution? And then a question from Jeannie Silver: which countries will advocate for Palestinian rights? There was a reference to the B'Tselem report describing Israel as an apartheid state. How can the BDS movement be more successful? I guess that's the question, but also about the B'Tselem report and this kind of new, but not really new, announcement about the apartheid situation. Will the Biden administration actually respond to that or take it seriously? And I'll give each one of you about a minute to respond to any of those questions, and then we'll end. Let's start with Charles, and then we'll go in the same order that we started with. Charles?
Thank you. Let me respond first of all to the question on Egypt, and I imagine Khalil will have something to add here. But the question being, how can we pressure Biden's administration to release all political prisoners and also offset the effect of the lobbying of Yusuf al-Taiba, Israel, and Saudi Arabia on this? And I think to this specific question, I think it's very important for Egyptian activists and those who speak out on their behalf in this country, in Canada, in the EU, to be visible to the incoming Biden administration. I remember when I was at Freedom House having conversations with people in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau who thought that the Egypt activists weren't all that effective on making a case for continued political change and in Egypt all on their own. They appeared to some of these officials as disorganized, not knowing quite what they wanted, and so on. So it's, I think, critical for activists and their supporters overseas to be able to speak to very specific ideas, a powerful agenda, and to be constantly visible in Congress as well as in the halls of the administration to help make that case and to counter views coming in from other countries who are not so friendly to the rights of Egyptians politically or of the rights of political prisoners and so on. That'd be one thing that I think is very important. And just there was one other question, and this was on, I was one who referred to the B'Tselem report on apartheid. I don't have any advice for the BDS movement in particular, but on the question of which countries will advocate for Palestinian rights, one of the things that I think is very important for the Biden administration to do is to reactivate multilateral diplomacy in the United Nations with the EU and with other like-minded countries on these political issues. And I think it will find a lot of common cause with a number of other countries on this. Apartheid, saying apartheid in connection with Israel is one of the third rails of US, Middle East policy, that you'd never want to touch that. But I think there are things that the administration can do. Zaha named some of them to highlight the issues of Palestinian rights. I think it's something that the administration can take on rhetorically in general and say, look, this is something that is important to us and we take it seriously. And that in itself sends a powerful signal. And this, the administration won't even want to touch, conditioning aid on improvements, but there are things that it can do well short of that, they'll nevertheless create a new climate that I think it could consider.
Okay. Zeina, would you like to answer the question that was addressed to you?
Sure. It'll be very brief. The only kinds of additions we added to the book are just updates in the form of footnotes. We didn't change anything in what people wrote, but things like the National Defense Authorization Act. Somebody mentioned it, and then something happened with it later. It was vetoed by Trump, and then the Congress overrode his veto. So we put that in a footnote. The number of people who have died from COVID-19, we updated that in a footnote. Of course, that's out of date again already. And things like the Saudi women's, what happened with her, somebody mentioned her in their paper, and so we had a footnote to update it. So those are the kinds of updates. We added maybe about 20 some odd footnotes for the whole book.
Thank you, Zeina. And I would just like to note that Zaha Hassan had to leave us. She had another commitment at this time. But we'll answer the remaining questions, give each of our remaining panelists a minute to respond, and hope you all can stay with us. Khalil, please.
Thank you, Tamara, for the question of Mustafa Youssef. And I would like to echo what Charles mentioned about I think the major issue in Egypt is not only that Egypt has one of the most brutal dictatorial authoritarian regime in its history now, but also it has a very fragmented, weak, and dysfunctional opposition that failed over the last 7 years to garner the support of outside players in order to put a pressure on the regime in Egypt. Having said that, still there is a room to make a pressure, particularly to hold Biden accountable to what he said about during the campaign about not giving a carte blanche for Trump's favorite dictator to do whatever he wants in Egypt. And I think at least there are three areas that activists and political opposition can have an impact on that issue. The first thing is to have a unified voice, a unified front, a unified opposition that would have a clear program for change in Egypt and for inclusion in Egypt, which I think it's a very tough task to have right now. But this is at least that should be done. The second thing is communicating with civil society organizations, particularly those who are active in human rights, particularly in DC. We have, over the last few years, there are a few organizations that emerged, particularly when it comes to Egypt. For instance, Freedom Initiative, Dunne, the Democracy for the Arab World Now. These are new organizations that really advocate for democracy. Egyptian opposition and activists should communicate with these organizations and try to have an impact through them. The third is to lobbying congressmen and congresswomen who are in favor of human rights and democracy promotion, particularly Tom Malinowski, as Chris Murphy as well. They were outspoken about the violations of human rights, particularly in Egypt, so they can have an impact, particularly when it comes to the U.S. aid or assistance to Egypt, that they can put some conditions to improve human rights in exchange of this aid. So there are still some room that opposition in Egypt can have to have an impact on Biden administration.
Thank you, Khalil. And we apologize for going a little bit over time. Diana, would you like to give some concluding remarks?
Yes, I will answer briefly regarding the ammonium nitrate cargo that exploded last August. Unfortunately, if we look at the investigation, it's no less than a scandal. It's very outrageous that 5 months after the explosion, we don't have a single official that has been questioned or indicted, although that 25 Lebanese officials, including the president, the prime minister, ministers, security officers, and judges knew about the ammonium nitrate, and none of them have been questioned. Moreover, last week, new information have disclosed that the real owners of the shipment were Syrian businessmen connected to the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. Unfortunately, the Lebanese government didn't even question or send any, did not ask for any clarifications or even take it seriously. So in a nutshell, how Lebanon is dealing with the crime of port explosion is a key indicator of how failed the country has become. And this is how the future of the country will be defined. Will there be an accountability for this horrendous crime or not? This is the real question for the Lebanese people now. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. And Dan, you have the last word.
I'll say, sorry about that. I'll say very quickly, one of the things that ties this discussion together is this importance of human rights. And I think that it'll be relatively easier for the incoming administration to sort of raise the issue of human rights in the region than democracy per se. And I've written about this for the Arab Center and others, and to have leverage. And that is in regards to Iran. I don't expect, and I certainly hope that the Biden administration does not walk away from a human rights agenda when it comes to Iran, even as it re-engages. But given the fact that we have strategic relationships with so many countries in the region who are supposed friends and not enemies that are abusers of human rights, I think we can engage with them and at the same time emphasize human rights. And on this score, to echo what Charles said in his report, the issue of political prisoners in Saudi Arabia, God knows in Egypt, and other countries, and obviously Iran executions, should and hopefully be a major issue that the new administration raises and does so very loudly as well as quietly.
Thank you, Dan. And with that, we've reached the end of this webinar. On behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C., I would like to thank all our speakers for their time and excellent, insightful contributions. I would like to thank all of you, our viewers, for joining in on Zoom and on our website. I just want to mention that the video of this discussion will be available on our website later today if you'd like to go back and watch it. And again, the full book is already accessible on our website, the electronic version. It is an electronic book, arabcenterdc.org/books. You can read all the chapters, 19 of them there. We invite you to stay in touch, follow our work at arabcenterdc.org. Thank you once again to all of you, and we look forward to seeing you again at our future events. Thank you and take care.